Bellerophon, son of Poseidon and Eurynome, slew the Chimera and, filled with hubris, believed he had a rightful place on Mount Olympus among the gods, and set off there on his winged horse Pegasus. Zeus did not like this at all, and sent an actual gadfly to sting Pegasus, and Bellerophon, thrown from his bucking steed, fell back to earth and died. So it goes. The story of modernist architecture, and perhaps modernity as an epoch, as an epistemological framing of reality, has maybe been a little tinged by Bellerophon's spirit. We have defeated all the monsters, made an architecture and an urbanism which has done away with ills, social and pathological, and thus deserve a place on high among the deities. But perhaps, as COVID showed, modernism has somewhat overplayed its hand. The monsters, at will, can get amongst us again. So it goes. In this episode of the A is for Architecture podcast, the 200th, I spoke to the great architectural historian and theorist Beatriz Colomina, Howard Crosby Butler Professor of the History of Architecture at Princeton University, about some small parts of the recently published book Sick Architecture, which she edited with Nick Axel, Guillermo Arzuaga and Eflux Architecture, and published with MIT Press. In the book, 36 essays from around the world present ways architecture has both engaged with sickness as illness, but also as structure, logic and motivation. If you want to support the A is for Architecture podcast beyond listening to it and sharing it, you can do so by either subscribing on Patreon or making a gift via Buy Me a Coffee. Links to this and to the book and the Good Professor are in the podcast description.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the A is for Architecture podcast. I'm delighted to be talking today to Professor Beatriz Colomina. Beatriz, thank you so much for meeting with me and talking about this. We're going to be talking about your book from last year, Sick Architecture, which you published with the MIT Press and you co-edited with Nick Axel, Guillermo Arzuaga and Eflux Architecture. It's a really interesting book, 36 essays over 4 themes of, now I'm going to try and get this right, borders, bodies, atmospheres and landscapes. And we're going to dig around in a little bit of that because there's a lot of ground that it covers. But before we do that, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself with as much detail as you fancy?
Okay, so thank you so much for having me again in this A for Architecture. I love to be part of your podcast. I'm Beatriz Colomina. I was born in Spain, but I live in New York for many, many years, more than 4 years, and I am a professor at Princeton University in the School of Architecture. Right, so...
Did you study in Spain? Did you study to be an architect in Spain?
Yes, I studied architecture in Barcelona, in the School of Architecture of Barcelona, which at that time was a very extraordinary school. In fact, many of my professors ended up being professors in the United States, like people like Rafael Moneo or Ignacio Solá Morales, or real celebrities in the world of architecture were teaching in Barcelona at that time. So I consider myself very lucky to have been in this school.
Oh, are you a Catalonian?
No, I was born in Madrid actually, and I grew up in Valencia, which has a little bit of the same kind of culture and language. Valencian is very close to Catalonian. People in Valencia think it's different, but it's not really much difference. But I went to the university in Barcelona precisely because it was such an extraordinary school. And shortly after, I came to New York to start research towards my dissertation, and I ended up teaching at Columbia University first and at Princeton right after. So I never went back, basically.
Wonderful.
Unexpected.
Yeah, New York is a special place. It's a very sticky place. What was your PhD in?
Oh, that's a very interesting question, because I came as a fellow in the New York Institute for the Humanities, which at that time was run by Richard Sennett. Richard Sennett was a friend of a professor of mine in Barcelona, and that's how I ended up there. Now, when I came to New York, I had no idea where I was going. Institute in Spain sounds like a place where there are starting to do dissertation, basically students. But I found myself, surprisingly enough, surrounded by real celebrities in the world of culture, people like Susan Sontag, who has just written her book Illness as Metaphor, and Karl Soske, and Tony Bidler, and Wolfgang Siebelsbusch, and so many people from literature, from all kinds of fields. And there I was, a kid, basically in her 20s, in architecture, completely amazed by this incredible group of people that work in a very interdisciplinary way, right? And I was very impressed by Susan Sontag's book on illness as metaphor. And I started to see that there was a lot of architecture in that story, that one could think about the sanatoria and the sanatorium movement and the way in which architecture somehow of the sanatoria was so revolutionary, and how much it influenced modern architecture, and how all the architects of this period, from Le Corbusier to Loos to Mist, they are all Neutra, etc. They are all obsessed with tuberculosis, and how this obsession with tuberculosis, which is not surprising because at that time, at the turn of the century, 1 in 3 people were dying of tuberculosis in places like Paris or London. And globally it was 1 in 5. So no, you think COVID was bad. This was bad. And it was very interesting to me that architects took upon themselves the task of doing something about it, right? And so this architecture, this modern architecture that we always thought in terms of style, white walls, big windows, roof terraces, etc., ventilation, detachment from the ground with these thin columns called pilotis, etc., in many ways are a response to tuberculosis, in all ways are a response to tuberculosis. And it seemed to me like this was an extraordinary possibility for a PhD, since I was still in search for a topic. In the institute, everybody thought that this was an amazing idea. But after that year, when I went to Columbia University and also in contact with Barcelona, nobody in architecture thought that this was a good topic. They thought, that's a very good topic for literature, what Susan Sontag did, whoever did. But, and I kept insisting, no, there's a lot of architecture there. Let me explain. Yeah, no. So then I ended up doing, why don't you do something more architectural? So I did something more architectural in the sense that I did my dissertation on Loos and Le Corbusier, and in fact, the question of architecture and media. And this is the amazing thing. It became my book, Privacy and Publicity. So this is actually my dissertation. So I don't have any complaints in the sense that the book became a major bestseller and it's still sold copies like if it was published yesterday, which astonishes me. But this question of health and architecture and the question of disease always was like the repressed topic, no? So in many ways, X-ray architecture, my book X-ray architecture, was like the return of the repressed, a book that I did much later, and in many ways starts with these investigations that I already was doing around 1980 in the Institute for the Humanities in New York, right? But it's a book that I published in 2000 and, I don't know, 18 or 19 or something like this. So way later, when I didn't need to demonstrate to anybody anything, I went back to what really I care about. Now, this book, Sick Architecture, in many ways follows from that, from X-ray architecture, in the sense that I was teaching at Princeton a class, believe it or not, on architecture in the age of pandemics, way before COVID, right? So, and in these discussions of architecture and health and all the ways in which epidemics have left always a trace on the city, if you think about all the lazarettos in Italy, all the kind of great urban wars of the 19th century, the sewage system, the clean waters, the parks, etc., they are unthinkable without the great epidemics of the 19th century of cholera, typhoid fever, etc. For example, the embankment of London may be very well admired today as a great piece of public architecture, but in fact it's unthinkable without the cholera epidemics. It was precisely because of this that the parliament that was had these incredible smells, the great stink of London that led to the construction of the embankment that contains actually the sewage system that clean London, and of course before the seed was thrown into the Thames, and it was all, a disaster, basically in health and also smells. So in many ways, the history of architecture is the history of disease, and this is what we were exploring in this seminar at Princeton for several years before, for 2, maybe 3 years before COVID happened.
And sort of COVID acts then as the kind of accelerator for this moment, doesn't it? I think it turned us all on to the idea of the pathology, the present pathology.
Exactly. And then the students were asking me, how did you know? How did you know that, that this was coming? I said, no, I didn't know, except that we all knew, because it was all over in the newspapers constantly, that an epidemic was bound to happen sooner or later. But we all think, oh yeah, sure, it happens. Like we all know that we are going to die, but we don't really think that it's going to happen soon. So it was surprising, and in this moment in which we were all confined at home, and the students were at Princeton were depressed because suddenly they couldn't travel to Europe, so to wherever, to Asia, to Latin America, as they normally do in the summer, to start work towards their dissertation. They were there stuck in their dorms or in their apartments in Princeton, completely depressed, when all of a sudden these people from IFLAX, Nicholas Hirsch and Nika Axel, called me, and they are friends of mine from a while. And Nicholas says, but weren't you teaching a class on architecture in the age of pandemics? I said, yeah, sure, I was teaching that. Why don't we publish the IFLAX? Why don't you ask the students to put, to have their papers, and we edited them. So I put together a collection of papers that came out from the class, and we edited over the summer, and that got the students very engaged, and they were published as a series in IFLAX Architecture, and then another series in IFLAX Architecture. And finally, Nicholas Hirsch, who is the director of TIBA, which is the Center for Architecture in Brussels, this museum and archive in Brussels, offered us to do an exhibition there based on this research. So then came the exhibition, and finally came the book. So in the end, the book collects many of the students' writings over the years, but also new scholars that wrote for the book, that wrote for the exhibition. So in fact, it's a great collection of essays that has to do with the question of architecture and disease, architecture and epidemics, and the ways in which architecture has always been tangled with disease from the very beginning.
The book covers a very global perspective. Did you find in that, and in the process of kind of putting the book together, that there was a variety of interpretations of this thing? Or was there kind of a coherence to it? I guess what I'm asking is that the way that we frame the idea of sickness, did you find that to be a culturally conditioned thing? And that in certain contexts, for example, living alongside certain types of illness might not be possible or permissible in other places. And therefore you kind of end up even defining the idea of sickness becomes quite contested.
Yes, that's a very, very interesting observation. Of course, the book is a number of case studies, which came actually from the diversity also of backgrounds and of the students. I mean, there are students from China. So a student from China was doing a very interesting case, Chen Chen-Yan, about the introduction of the sanatorium in Shanghai by an architect that had studied in Hamburg and then went back to China. And it's a little bit of a cultural discussion also from the old Chinese ideas about how to treat tuberculosis to the new sanatoria idea that came from the West. There was a former student from Princeton that had done a study on the medical treatises on plantations, because of course plantation owners, believe it or not, it was in their best interest to keep their slaves in health. So there are treatises of health in plantations There is another student that was doing the Panama Canal and how the Panama Canal, which in terms of engineering was already quite well resolved, and the French had attempted to do this, was basically the conquest of the mosquito and the conquest of malaria and the conquest of all these tropical diseases. And so you see in the construction of the Panama Canal all these architectural devices that are put in place so that the workers in the Panama Canal operation were protected from the mosquito. So the mosquito became an agent. And other people were doing work on other parts of the world, Latin America, Asia, Europe, etc., which, as you point out, means also different understandings of what disease is. But overall, the focus was on what effects is this having on the architecture, right? So the Sikh architecture means exactly that, in which way is architecture in many ways related, entangled with disease. How the history of architecture, you could write a different history of architecture from the point of view of disease. That is, then it will be a history of the architecture and of the city as a series of structures and infrastructures that are put in place to combat the previous epidemic. So the lazaretos, or the embankment of London, or the urban parks, or the open, Haussmann, for example, has always been, in terms of Haussmann from Paris, the great plan for Paris of the 19th century, has always thought in terms of control of the population. And it's true that he was the prefect of the police, and the control of the population was important. But what nobody talks about is that Haussmann was an health nut, and he had a lot of volumes in his office, all related to diseases, and particularly he was obsessed with tuberculosis. So all these big avenues and trees and air and circulation has a lot to do with the prevention of tuberculosis, and Haussmann himself died of tuberculosis. So
It's really fascinating. I want to come on to this moment around modern architecture. Now, you presented modern architecture at the beginning there as this kind of response to pathology, to disease, to specifically tuberculosis, which is, I think, a really generous and elegant way of talking about it, because it's such a contested kind of paradigm, I think. And you describe it in the book as a prophylactic defense. Modern architecture as a prophylactic defense and an antibiotic. That functions to save lives. But you also talk about it in a way as creating its, well, literally you say it created its own monsters. So in a way, the Sikh in Sikh architecture is both an architecture that is oriented towards addressing sickness, but has become the sickness itself.
Yes, this is a paradox that is at the very beginning of architecture. The moment that we went indoors, I'm not talking about living in caves or in baskets or in any of these kind of structures in which the air is passing constantly. The moment that we went indoors in the Neolithic, right? The moment that we really constructed walls around ourselves. Diseases that did not exist before, such as tuberculosis, for example, became epidemics. We became shorter as human beings and die also earlier. Isn't that amazing? And so architecture produces disease. And this is something that a doctor called Richardson that wrote for the catalog and the books that were published in connection with the health exhibition in London in 1884. Big health exhibitions were all over Europe at that time, and the UK, in London, but also in Dresden, in Berlin, etc. And these were massive events in which, millions of people will go to these things, and they were educational, right? And it's super interesting that so much of architecture is those things. But what struck me about what Richardson says is human beings, in constructing protection from the elements, have produced the conditions for disease. Now, he didn't have any evidence of that yet, but he's completely correct, because recent excavations of Neolithic settlements have discovered precisely this, that as we went indoors, diseases like tuberculosis appear. No, tuberculosis is an ancient disease, but it was never an epidemic. It was never a problem because people were living in, in the open air. And you can see in the skeletons found in these settlements the traces of tuberculosis. So he's right. That man, in protecting from the elements, from the weather, constructed the conditions of disease. He says that in 1884. And in fact, you can say that the history of architecture, in that sense, is a history of disease, because the moment that we went indoors, we have diseases that didn't exist before. And the paradox is that the architect is always presented himself or herself as producing health, right? So Vitruvius at the, in the first century BC, he is already declaring that the architect's most important task is to produce health, right? And he talks about the theory of the four humors, which is the dominant theory of health at that time, and the orientation of the site and the airs and the winds this way and the other way. And with each new period, you have a new theory of health. So in the 20th century, to go back to your question about modern architecture, the dominant idea still is the germ idea of the disease. So for a long time in the 19th century is the miasma theory of disease, the idea that the smells and the air is what is communicating disease. In fact, it took a long time for England, for the medical establishment of England to accept the idea that it was these little things in the water that were producing disease. The moment that Edward Koch and Pasteur discovered the connection between particular bacteria and particular diseases like tuberculosis or typhoid fever, etc., then we have the germ theory of the disease. Now, there were no antibiotics that were effective against there were no antibiotics really until 29. Penicillin is 1929, is Fleming. There is modern architecture way before this. So in a way, you can say that modern architecture was the antibiotic before antibiotics were discovered. In that sense that architects together with doctors were trying to think what will be the best environment to prevent tuberculosis. And of course, apart from going away from the city into the countryside, the mountains, etc., you need a particular architecture that allows the patient to be spending time outdoors, that the windows should be open, that the sun should come in, all these theories that then became eventually modern architecture. And particularly, and this is already evident in the 1884 health exhibition in London, dust is the enemy. For a long time I thought that this was a strange theory, that dust was the enemy. But in fact, it's correct. I mean, again, like with the other story of the Neolithic, if you have tuberculosis and you spit, and that spot now is dry and becomes part of the air, 15 days later, it's still contagious, right? So they were on their own. But if you expose it even momentarily to the sun, it becomes inactive. So they didn't know scientifically, but they knew in many ways that opening the house to the air and having terraces for the sun was a way of preventing disease. There's a way of preventing tuberculosis in particular, right? So in many ways, in that sense, you can argue that modern architecture saved tons of life. Maybe it was the most important thing they did. Forget about the aesthetics. The most important thing they did is to save lives in an age in which so many people were dying from tuberculosis. But again, like antibiotics were great. Antibiotics saved tons of lives all over the world. But the reality is that antibiotics created its own monsters because we have abused antibiotics, and now antibiotics are a problem. But modern architecture also became a problem by the same token. So because we abuse some aspects of modern architecture. So now we are in an age in which it's more dangerous to go to a hospital with some kind of, stupid reason, like, knee replacement. And then you die, like a friend of my sister died from an infection, and a man in good health in his 50s died of an infection that he picked up in the hospital. Before we know, he's in the in the intensive care, and before we know he has died. So the most dangerous thing right now is a hospital. The supposedly antiseptic walls of a hospital are teeming with the most dangerous bacteria, which is called Streamophiles. Streamophiles is the bacteria that has resisted every form of stream cleaning. They actually love that. It's the same bacteria that lives in nuclear plants or that we have sent into the space station. These bacteria that resist everything, right? And they are super dangerous because no antibiotic can. So the age of the antibiotic resistant bacteria is with us and is the main health problem that we have right now. And this became also the subject of the next book I wrote with Mark Wigley, that came out also this fall, which is called We the Bacteria. Have you seen it? This is a little book called We the Bacteria. It's the companion volume of Are We Human? We did it with Lars Muller. But, super fascinating how these three books, X-ray architecture, Sick architecture, and We the Bacteria, follow each other. And the more contemporary one, dealing with more contemporary issue of the antibiotic-resistant bacteria and the health crisis that we are in right now.
But I'm interested in this critique of modernism that you're making here, this idea that in a parallel way to the antibiotic crisis, that modern architecture has gone too far, that good logic that it had at the beginning, which was about air and light, and in a way sort of an antiseptic to the blight of overcrowded industrial centres, then takes that logic forward into a form of isolation and expects too much of itself, but also in that alienating way of the modern paradigm has kind of produced this pathological environment, which is not just in hospitals, it's also in the super sealed contemporary dwelling. It's also in the way that the psychosocial impacts of contemporary cities, which are affecting clearly people's mental well-being, sense of self, sense of identity, feelings of agency, which impacts their mental health. So I'm kind of interested in that. Is that a distinct critique that you're making? Is this, in a way, a new thing?
Well, maybe, because people against architecture, they have been from the very beginning of modern architecture. And I happen to love modern architecture, so I don't have that kind of critique. But precisely what you call the extra seal buildings that emerged precisely from the environmental crisis of the 70s. So you make buildings more energy efficient by sealing them more permanently. You cannot open windows in many of these office buildings and many hotels in America. And this created a problem where Le Corbusier was very happy to say that air conditioning clean the dirty outside air and produces this clean air inside. We know perfectly well that what he calls bâtiment hermetic buildings is a complete disaster for health, precisely because you don't let the air in, you don't get this and produces precisely this environment that is close to what is happening in hospitals, right? You produce a reduction of the diversity of bacteria in your houses, which is very good for health. This is the new theory of health, is all related to the microbiome, to the diversity of bacteria in your gut, which is basically the reason now it's understood to be the cause of all the disorders of our time: obesity, diabetes, many forms of cancer, all these autoimmune disorders, all these. Before, when I went to school, there was no kid in my school with allergy to peanuts or anything like that. There was not such a thing. And now it's been clearly demonstrated that over clean houses, well, the kids in these houses have much more chances to have an allergy that kids that play with the earth, that eat dirt. As one of the scientists that we work with, Martin Blesser, says, let them eat dirt, right? Let them eat dirt. It's very important. So exposure to the air, to the soil is absolutely important for our health and even mental health. Many of the epidemics of of depression and even suicide, even among very young people, which is so devastating, is now clearly understood to be a consequence of the reduction of diversity of bacteria in our guts, which is not just architecture. It's, of course, also what we put in our mouth, all these fast food diets and all this abuse of antibiotics and everything. But since we are in architecture, I want to insist on the fact that architecture is also involved in this diminishing diversity of bacteria in our lives, that is, according to the World Health Organization, is going to be very soon, this year, 2026, the major cause of death globally. Well, that's something that we should think about, right?
You would have thought. I mean, that's a big deal. I want to look at another aspect that I picked up in the book, which is this issue around the normalized body versus the ill body. And I think this is where you get to within the book as well, which is a really fascinating inflection point. And the way that you present modern architecture is about creating boundaries or borders between the healthy and the not healthy, between the normalized subject as a privileged entity and the abnormal or anormal or ill person as someone to be sort of actively, proactively marginalized. And of course, then that has connotations of racialization as well.
Of course.
How does this operate? And what are the kind of examples from the book that might point to this dynamic?
Right. Well, it's very much part of our culture. And if you think about architecture, at the center of architecture, there is always this very athletic, very white, very male, actually, subject, which is the man of Leonardo or the macho man of the modular of Le Corbusier. So for centuries, since the Renaissance, let's say, to modern architecture, we have the nerve to put at the center of architecture this macho man that we don't know where he came from. Because if you think about it, it excludes half of humanity. For once, no women are represented. But also, it's a very specific white man, very athletic, of a certain age, etc. And you think to yourself, well, even if you happen to be white and beautiful and athletic and all of this, congratulations. But how long does this last exactly? Because the human, in fact, is a very, very fragile creature. We are born very fragile. A zebra is born and a few hours later can walk along her mother and get some food. And a baby, it takes a long time to kind of become independent, right? We are very fragile when we are born. We are very fragile when we die, when we are old. And then we are very fragile in the middle. All kinds of things happen to us. We break a leg, we get pregnant, we have cancer, all kinds of things, right? And architecture doesn't account for that. It presumes that they are working for this idealized man that practically doesn't exist, or if it exists for a very short time. So in that sense, I was very inspired by Aalto at the time that he was built, Alvar Aalto and Aino Aalto, at the time they were doing their sanatorium in Paimio in Finland, a sanatorium for tuberculosis. And Alvar Aalto says that he had been very sick at the time of the commission for the building, and that precisely this experience of having to lie down for a long time, for long periods of time on the horizontal, has made him think about architecture, because he says, and it's a very interesting observation, that architecture is always conceived for the upright person. And there you have it again. The person in a wheelchair is not accounted for in architecture. It's always an afterthought, a ramp that you put there that doesn't work for anybody, right? And so he says something beautiful. He says the architect should always design for the person in the weakest position. So what I love, and of course, if the architect designs for the person in the weakest position, everybody else will be fine as well, right? So this is really remarkable, because it's actually understanding that disease that is normal. That that's part of who we are, that's part of how we live. So in many ways, this obsession we have with normality doesn't help anybody, really. So I think it was very remarkable that at the turn of the century, there was somebody already, an architect, that was thinking in those terms. When you think about the fact that only very recently we have started to take seriously the question of disabilities in architecture very recently, and it's always like an afterthought, as I say. So maybe something has to change at a different level, right?
You talk about medical events, and you mentioned this at the beginning, and how diseases are, as you put it, and I think I quote here, hosted within an architecture formed by previous diseases in a kind of archaeological nesting of disease. I quite like this idea. I think it's a very seductive idea. Architecture as a kind of repository, in a way. Quite similar to this idea of the palimpsest, but instead here a palimpsest of illness. Can you talk to this a little bit? And again, which papers in the book, which essays in the book do you feel perhaps explore this most transparently?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think, for example, about the paper on El Congo, no, and the fact that the Belgians arriving in Congo established this so-called cordon sanitaire, which is this 400-meter band, 400 wide, that will separate the city of the indigenous people from the city of the Europeans. Because, of course, they believe that the disease was with the indigenous people. And also the 400 meters is the idea that the mosquito can only fly, which is completely wrong, a maximum of 400 meters. So therefore, if you establish this band of separation between the two cities, then the Europeans will be protected. There is a lot of things to unpack there. The idea that the indigenous are the sick people, and in fact the Europeans were much more prone to get malaria, and because they were kind of immunized in some ways. But anyway, there is a trade of an urbanistic theme put in place precisely to prevent disease. So if you think about the lazaretos in Italy, or you think about the 19th century cities and all the infrastructure works of the 19th century, all this breaking through the fabric of the city to create great avenues for air and for ventilation and to clean up the so-called medieval city that Le Corbusier calls tubercular Paris. He thinks that he has to cut through like a surgeon, right? So, in fact, you can look at the history of architecture, as I was saying before, and identify all these different things that were put in place to combat the current preoccupation. We are always a step behind in a way. So, by the time we get to the new ones, we are already on the last one. But some things become useful during COVID. Many of the things that were put in place during the Great Black Death of the 13th century that devastated Asia and Europe. I mean, like 65% of the population was killed. That's a lot, over several waves of. It's astonishing. Half of the population was definitely gone, and that has enormous consequences, right? But all the things that were put in place, like the quarantine, these ideas were revived during COVID, so they remain with us. We were all quarantined, this time in our apartments, right? Rather than in specific lazaretos or places where you will be if you were suspected but not clearly ill, or lazaretos if you were definitely with the Black Death, right? So we have the same ideas again and again.
Yes. But we also have this amnesia that you speak of as well, this collective amnesia that forms once the emergency is over. And I was interested in thinking about that because, of course, we're only 6 years past the kickoff of the COVID crisis. And it seems almost impossible for people to even reflect back on it, right? In the general conversation, it's something that we've actively forgotten. Sort of like, and I'm going to speak as a man here, sort of like the pain of childbirth. Like, if you actually remembered what it was like, would you do it a second time? And yet Or if you remembered this is not an equivalent, and I'm not being an idiot here, but if you actually remembered how painful the first boxing match was, would you do a second boxing match? One assumes this is what's going on here.
Yes, and more than that, I think we don't want to be reminded of our own mortality. So illnesses, death, all these questions we live in a society that doesn't want to know anything about death. I mean, we try to keep it as far as possible. And so we develop these mechanisms of resistance, which I think are perfectly human. So as soon as the emergency passes, we all develop collective amnesia, which is very different than personal amnesia. It's just like it doesn't exist anymore, right?
And more than that, we then curate narratives that sort of justify our actions within that space. And is this materialized? I mean, I'm sort of fascinated by this because one of the things, as you've been talking, I've been thinking about memorials and the way that memorials are the little memento mori, the little thing that we do to kind of gather in collective trauma about illness or about violence or about warfare or whatever it is.
Yes, but look at the difference. I mean, 1918 flu, which is normally called the Spanish flu, but it's a complete misnomer because the disease originated in the United States and arrived in Europe via the soldiers. But Spain didn't enter the war, and therefore they didn't have censor in the newspapers. So all the newspapers in America and in Europe were supposed to not say anything negative, right? So they didn't talk about the fact that people were dying. And in Spain, they say, well, I mean, the newspaper didn't have any of these problems, so they start saying, there's a flu going around that is killing a lot of people. And so it became known as the Spanish flu when the Spanish didn't enter the war and didn't originate the disease. But anyway, the point is that the flu of 1918 killed more people than World War I and World War II combined. But everybody has forgotten about it. It's unbelievable. Nobody knows that fact. No, there's no serious study of this disease. I mean, there was a beautiful book written way before COVID on the flu of epidemics. I remember reading it because I'm always interested in diseases. And the man says in the introduction, I don't understand why a disease that killed so many people has not been seriously studied by others before this little book. And as soon as COVID started, this book became a bestseller, the 1918 flu. So we only became interested because there was another epidemic going on. And of course, the 1908 flu has an effect on architecture. I'm sure it has an effect on architecture. Have we studied that? No, right. So as soon as something happens, even as big as the 1918 flu, we are nowhere near in more recent epidemics like Ebola, AIDS, COVID, to the numbers of 1982 flu. So I think it's a very good example of how we develop collective amnesia. And this is not that far away. I mean.
And is that amnesia? Because I'm assuming, just like within COVID times, there was this spatialization of the disease, the keeping apart 2 meters or 6 feet, the staying in your homes, notions around home unmaking and remaking and making, and the way that urban space becomes kind of hyper-politicized, a new kind of sociality emerges, all of these things. And there's this big discussion around how we need to then inflect architectural design, particular discussions around collective dwelling so that the isolation of an illness like that might be ameliorated in future crises. I'm assuming for the Spanish flu, misnomer, but that's how people know it, there were likewise an embedding of this idea, as you've mentioned before, this archaeological nesting. But does that get forgotten as well? Does that get erased?
Totally forgotten. I mean, we were all shocked when we were asked to wear masks, all in shock. But these masks are very, very similar to the ones that people were asked to wear during the 1918 flu. You can see it in photographs of volunteers for the Red Cross in Boston. You can see the mask everywhere. And also, if you compare what was happening during COVID, when all these field hospitals were established all over the place in Madrid, that beautiful IFEMA, which is a center for conferences, and that is in illustrations in big photographs in chic architecture, well, that's very, very similar to the camps that were established during the 1980 flu in these big cavernous, again, spaces of stadia, of army spaces, huge spaces filled with beds, right? Exactly the same images that we saw during COVID. I think nobody remember that.
No. Well, no. I think they try not to remember that anyway,
Yeah.
which is not surprising, really, all things
Yeah, yeah,
considered.
it's human.
Yes. How might contemporary architects resist, if they should, how might contemporary architects resist this sense of erasure? Is there a responsibility? Does architecture as a kind of design practice, as a social art, and as something that's quasi-scientific as well, does it have a job to kind of embody these things? Are we called upon to be active in the memorialization of this? Just as when we look at the sanatorium by Alto, or just as when we look at the modernist architecture of the early 20th century, we can read it, as you do, as a manifestation of a relationship to disease. Should modern architects be pursuing this as a kind of language? And I guess, what would that look like?
Well, I think this is a little bit of what we argue, Mark and I, in the book of We, the Bacteria. There are precedents of architects that have worked with these ideas. I mean, you have Lina Bobardi when she established her glass house in Sao Paulo. He does something that no architect that I know have done, which is to draw every little insect, every little animal that is living on the side. So in a way to acknowledge that we are not the only ones on Earth, that we are part of this wider kind of ecology, and that when you plant your house in a particular place, as Lina Bobardi did in Sao Paulo, it seems like her interest is that all these creatures also will survive. So to think in terms of more than human is very, very important for the architect. To think about what health is today is very important for an architect. If Le Corbusier, if all the architects of the modern period, like Neutra, etc., were all concerned with tuberculosis, now we have the question of the, as we were saying before, bacteria resisting to antibiotics, and the need to create spaces that are more open to the outside, that allow this environment in which a more diverse bacteria thrives. We shouldn't be using all this antiseptic, this and that, because we are turning our houses into hospitals. There is a very interesting study that was done, experiment that was done during COVID in Italy. In 5 hospitals, they did something unbelievable. Instead of cleaning with the usual crazy protocols of eliminating every possible creature, they spray the walls with good bacteria. And the amazing results is that people with COVID in those hospitals recovered earlier, they had less secondary infections, etc. They left the hospital earlier. So that was a very good example of what to do to make things better. You need to live with the enemy. The microbiome, the gut, is kind of a combination of good and bad bacteria, and the health is determined by this balance between good and bad bacteria. So I think architects today should inform themselves into the latest science on health, and produce again something that has been done since Vitruvius, an architecture that responds to these new concerns. I mean, a few years ago there was a very, very interesting example in Kairela, in Finland. This part of the Soviet Union was split after the war between a part that remained in the Soviet Union and the part that remained that stay in Finland. And this is the same genetic material, the same people, the same thing. And they did a fantastic study of the kids in both the Russian side now and the Finnish side. And the Finnish side, of course, became industrialized, became rich. Those are the people that you would suppose they will have better health. Well, the opposite happened. It turned to be that the people in the Finnish side had all the problems of the Western world. Kids with allergies, with autoimmune disorders, early forms of cancer, I don't know what, all of them, right? And the kids on the Russian side, which remain rural, and they had the normal problems of childhood, but they didn't have any of these problems. So you have there a very interesting case study of a group of kids with the same genetic material and completely different health outcomes. So, it's something to think about, right?
It is, it is. To finish, this lovely idea, sorry, lovely is probably the wrong word, but very fascinating idea around sickness not as the exception but the norm.
Yeah.
And you mentioned this earlier, this idea of designing for the person in the weakest position.
And accepting that we are all, in a way, sick, that nobody's perfect. This idea of this idealized human doesn't exist, and we all live precisely with our little ailments or bigger ailments. And it's very important to acknowledge that diversity of.
For sure. And it's easy, I suppose, or easier to think about that at the level of the building. What does it mean for the city? What does it mean for the contemporary city, which is now so big? And you live in New York.
I live in New York. I love New York.
Yeah, I know. It's amazing. It's a force of nature,
Yeah.
but it's not designed for those in the weakest position.
I don't know. I find it easier to live in New York than to live in a suburb, definitely. First year I was teaching at Princeton. I lived there, and I thought to myself, what a nightmare this is. I have to take my daughter to a school by car, half an hour this way, half an hour the other way. Then everything I needed, I have to go to Route 1 to get it. Again, the car. I mean, in New York, I don't have a car. I never had a car in New York. It's fine. A lot of people retire in New York. There are all these great buildings with elevators and super in the ground floor that help you up with your groceries and those and that. I'm not in that kind of building, but I think New York is a very accessible city. The subway is not that great, but it's very accessible in that sense that you can be in a wheelchair and you can go to the Lincoln Center and you can have your groceries delivered in your apartment, and you don't need a car, and you have everything you need at your fingerprints. I mean, it's not cheap. That's the problem with New York. It's become a very, very expensive place to live, particularly in terms of real estate. Everything else is fine. So that is a problem, but I don't have anything against big cities, no.
No, but does the city have to change if we are to reflect upon this notion of sickness? Does the new paradigm of sickness, the new crises that we have, and the anesthetic quality of increasingly large amounts of our urban space, these extremely sealed buildings, which are undoubtedly environmentally, performance-wise, great, but are becoming, through cycling air and so on and so forth, becoming actually problematic for our health, not least because they stop us moving around. They encourage forms of work, sitting on your backside, being very stressed in front of Zoom, for example, which are which are extremely damaging for people's health, produce obviously heart disease, obesity, depression, all of these things. So I guess that as an image of us sat here on Zoom, that in a way is productive of a pathology, and architecture has started to accommodate that. The city has started to accommodate the architecture that accommodates that. How would it change?
I don't know. I think people in the suburbs are also on Zoom sitting on a chair. And I think people in the suburbs are a lot more sedentary than people in cities. I mean, people in New York, their apartments are so small, they're always in the street. They're always running around. Everybody walks because there is no car. It's mad to have a car in New York. You have to pay for the parking like you will pay for an apartment anywhere else, right? So most people, if they can, they walk all over. So that's good. And the parks are great. Central Park, the Riverside Park, all these parks are amazing. So, I mean, this is not just a problem of cities, but if you want to think about what architecture can do, I'm very encouraged by architects like Andrés Jaque in Madrid, the Office of Political Innovation, and he's also the Dean of Columbia University. And if you think about the School for Little Kids that he did in Madrid, again, it's a great experiment with these new blocks made with fungi and with all these little things that are much healthier. So the kind of materials that we use, the kind of exposure, as I say, to the non-human is absolutely relevant to the health of our planet and of ourselves in the future. I mean, the situation is so daring that some of the scientists we are working with, Martin Blesser, for example, he talks about the silent extinction of microbes, and he believes, and many of his colleagues, microbiologists, etc., believe that this crisis is bigger and will kill us before than climate change. So, I mean, if we don't take that seriously in architecture, I don't know what else. Finally, we are thinking about climate change after all these years of ignoring it. Maybe we also have to think about this because it's very important.
Indeed it is. It's a great point to finish on. Beatriz, thank you so very much.
Thank you so much.
It is just an illusion we have here on Earth that one moment follows another one, like beads on a string, and that once a moment is gone, it's gone forever. When a Tralfamadorian sees a corpse, all he thinks about is that the dead person is in a bad condition in that particular moment, but that the same person is just fine in plenty of other moments. Now, when I myself hear that somebody is dead, I simply shrug and say what the Tralfamadorians say about dead people, which is, so it goes. That's from Kurt Vonnegut's excellent Slaughterhouse 5. Thank you to Beatriz for the conversation, suitable I think for a bicentennial, and for tolerating my flood of emails. Thank you also to Cassie at the MIT Press for making it possible. Please see the podcast description for links to Beatriz at work, to the book, and to monetary ways you can support the podcast. And thanks for listening.